Hi everyone. In today's session, I would like to talk briefly about the history of the relationship between psychology and culture. Traditionally, the relationship between psychology and culture existed in the history in a strange way. We could see a love and hate relationship between these two domains. Probably the first lover of culture from psychology was none other than William Wundt, who developed the first laboratory at Leipzig. His book titled Volker Psychology in 1888 addressed the question of interaction between psychology and culture. He believed that all phenomena with which mental sciences deals are indeed the creation of social community. But the mainstream psychology paid more attention to his experimental approach rather than his observation about cultural artifacts and language. For many decades, psychology was again untouched by the issue of culture. Bartlett's work in 1923 about psychology and primitive cultures gave some revival to the study of culture and psychology. Many scholars attempted to rebuild the connection between these two main domains in different times. For example, Whiting and Child in 1953, Whiting in 1975 studied the relationship between culture and personality. Siegel, Campbell and Herkowitz in 1966 focused on perception and cultures. McClelland 1961 motivation and culture. Witkin and Berry in 1975, Cronbach and Druth in 1972 focused on cognition and mental abilities. But unfortunately, these initiatives did not receive enough foothold in the mainstream debate in psychology. Now, let us look at the revival of the interface between culture and psychology. It was during the 1980s and 1990s psychology again fell in love with the culture. That is a time where the relationship between culture and psychology began to emerge as a major research area in psychology. In large part, this was due to the theoretical and methodological advances, yet it was also propelled by the fertile social, economic and political ground that called out for social psychological research on cultural differences. This led to emergence of a culturally informed psychology. Let us look at the emergence of cultural psychology. I would like to briefly talk about some of this scholarly work contributed to these movements. Cultural anthropologist Richard Schweder, who coined the term cultural psychology, published influential works like Thinking Through Cultures, Expeditions in Cultural Psychology and Why Do Men Barbecue? Recipes for Cultural Psychology, in which he addressed the interface between psychology and culture in a relevant manner. In his 1990 book Acts of Meaning, cognitive psychologist Jerome Bruner challenged the mainstream scientific view of cognitive process as information processing system and described how mind both constitutes and is constituted by culture. Sudhir Kakar, a psychoanalyst from India, coined the term Indian cultural psychology, addressed the issue of Indian identity in a larger psychologist context. Kakar's research consistently approached the question of culture and psychoanalysis in Indian context. He explored answers to many fundamental questions of humankind in the cultural context of India without creating much binaries. Other scholars like Girishwar Misra, Durganand Sinha, Ajit Dalal, social psychologists in India, also took up the issue of culture in the context of Indian psychology. In a parallel movement, psychologists such as Hofstede, Harry Trindis and others began to identify cultural dimensions that may help explain psychological phenomenon, a discipline known as cross-cultural psychology. Based on his study of work values of IBM employees from more than 40 countries around the world, Hofstede in 1980 identified several cultural dimensions including what has become the most popular individualism versus collectivism. In a classic 1991 paper, social psychologists Hazel Rose, Marcus and Shinobu Kitayama proposed the idea of independent and interdependent self and argued that these self-construals vary across cultures. Let's look at the perspectives of cultural psychology. Cultural psychology addresses how local cultural practices shape psychological processes. Schweder in 1991 proposed that cultural psychology is a study of the way cultural traditions and social practices regulate, express and transform the human psyche. The perspectives in cultural psychology initiated new dialogues about the interface between psychology and culture, which inspires the researchers and practitioners to revisit the universal understanding of psychology. Thank you. Have a good day.